Hello and welcome to once again the realm of ideas is free to all. This is episode 16, emotional attachment to ideas, subtitle is desire and frailty. These are a series of ruminations I do once a week, Sunday morning at 3 o'clock in the morning, New York City time. And they're basically a series of ideas that I've developed over the years in terms of my thinking, in terms of my research into architecture and draftsmanship and just basic speculation about the world. So it's kind of like how I kind of see is I've kind of come to my particular beliefs and way in which I kind of structure my work. Anyway, we started. I had started this before as a series of lectures or ruminations. I'd gotten I think up to like 30, and then I basically felt that I got kind of had a problem with the platform. So the platform basically uh, became a problem. So I had to start again, which was fine because I felt as if the ideas were already kind of clear to my mind. So it was easy to just kind of transfer them to YouTube. And I've kind of had a reasonably good time putting them back together. So basically, we started with a series of ideas, which was the operation. How I basically organize my thought. I talked about the operation of the metaphor, and it's kind of a way in which I kind of believe that my curiosity, imagination manifests itself. Then I talked about the fact that as I kind of went through time, I realized that operation was actually something that was connected to kind of other things that actually started to lead me in kind of more positive directions. I talked about the idea that there was an organic metaphor and that was a kind of aspect of nature. And then I talked about the artificial or aesthetic metaphors, which was what most people understand. And then I talked about unbreakable bonds, which were specific kind of proto metaphors that could exist societally. From there, I went on to other things, talked about value, talked about criticism, talked about the view of criticism, and brought up the idea of like societal health, about how certain things and the way they're viewed based on the way in which you kind of see the world could be an indicator of societal health or kind of illness. Then I went through a series of kind of talks about how I got to architecture and what I saw architecture as. From there, I basically went into some things related to my own architecture, and then kind of came out to the other side where we're talking about last week was indicators of societal health. I went over a series of things just to backtrack to that idea that I had brought up before about the fact that there are certain things that we can kind of chart and see that have consequence and allow us to kind of make progress. So now we're kind of going into something that's kind of like maybe a specific thing that we have to be watchful over, which is the idea of emotional attachment to ideas. And what I mean by that is not that we don't have desires, and we don't have passions, and there aren't things and impulses that drive us. I mean, I'm not kind of here talking about free will, if it exists or not. I believe in free will. I believe that if it does or does not exist, I believe it benefits me to kind of believe that free will exists, and that I should kind of like I should proceed as if that's the case, that I'm actually kind of like in a situation where I make the decisions that I make. I talked about the fact that there's a difference between what I would call freedom and what I would call kind of like social liberty. Social liberty is that which is granted by a group to kind of give people opportunities to kind of act in certain ways. And freedom is basically the kind of necessity to kind of choose paths, to constantly move amongst opportunities and options, and kind of make evaluations and examinations. So that's basically it. I mean, I've talked about some of the people who have kind of shaped my thinking. I've talked about David Hume. I've talked about Alfred North Whitehead. I've talked about Ortega Gasset. I've talked about Voltaire, Diderot. I think I kind of come from that European, like 18th, 19th, 20th century tradition of what I guess we would call liberalism. I do believe that in terms of like if I have a political leaning, it's probably in terms of what I would call myself an Enlightenment liberal. I believe I do believe strongly in the idea of giving as much social liberty to the individual in order to kind of allow them to kind of emancipate themselves greatest in terms of having the greatest opportunities for their freedom, so that they have the social liberties that allows them to take as many opportunities and actions. I believe that there needs to be a kind of equality of all people in terms of the tolerance that we show, in terms of the freedoms that we express, and in terms of, I mean, the freedoms are given, but in terms of the social liberties and tolerance and opportunity. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. But anyway, what's interesting is that a lot of, when I first gave these talks, which I guess was now a couple of years ago, I found them not to be at all political. I found them kind of like just basically kind of somewhat fairly simple philosophical truths. Not saying axiomatically, but I did feel as if, like, these were kind of fairly benign, fairly simple, fairly clear ideas that I think that were not really so much under concern. But what's interesting is that as time has gone on, I kind of think an indicator of what I would say a kind of societal unhealth is the fact that some of these things have come under scrutiny or come under attack. And I find that troubling. The last, I'd say probably starting in 2014, so we're talking about 11 years ago, and then especially I'd say the last 2 or 3 years, the world has become a somewhat troubling place. I'm not going too much into detail in terms of that, but I mean, America has had its turmoils and its troubles, and it still does. And I'm not kind of like making this, not going to talk about names or politics or left or right or anything like that. I just find as if, like, there is a very deeply divided world, and my nation is very deeply divided. Though right now it seems to kind of be specifically clear about its direction and has an individual who is kind of leading that direction, good or bad. It does seem as if there is at the moment a majority behind that position. I don't know if I call it a mandate. It's been called a mandate. I'm not sure that's the right term. But anyway, so one of the things I think has become a problem is this emotional attachment to ideas. Now, what do I mean by that? I think what happens is when an individual becomes too emotionally invested in something for whatever the reason is, and can't see the fact that it's time to move on from that, it becomes an impediment to that person. And I think that if there is an advantage to being able to make progress as an artist or in any speculative vein, it's from being honest. Now, let me distinguish the difference between honesty and truth. Truth is that thing which we pursue in the hopes that we can understand something in its essence. It may not exist. Honesty is believing that what you were saying is actually what you believe you saw or heard or felt or smelt. So an example is there an absolute truth in terms of the beauty of this particular piece of art? That's an engagement into the truth of a statement. Now, honesty is this individual believes that what they're telling you is in fact what they saw, what they heard, etc. An example of this is if I look at a car and I say, I believe that car was blue. Now I'm either being honest or dishonest, but if I believe that what I saw was a blue car and I say, I believe I saw a blue car, that is my honest appraisal. So there's an honest appraisal, meaning I believe, if I had to say honestly, this was indeed a blue car. So then if somebody kind of illustrates to me, oh, okay, well, because of the way you were looking at it, because of the sunlight and the angle, it actually isn't a blue car, it's a green car, because you were looking at it in a certain direction, the light was pointing on it. And actually, if you look closely, right, I mean, one of the things we all understand is that, like, color can be very, very malleable, and based on the way that the sun shines and the way that the kind of like the light moves, it can change that. And so that's what I mean by honesty. Again, truth being that aspect of what we believe is a deep, meaningful understanding of some object. So, like, what is the truth about liberty? What is the truth about the consequence of circumstance or being? So that's the difference. So we have this idea of, like, honesty, and truth. So now we go to this idea we talked about, unbreakable bonds, and an example of an unbreakable bond was kind of something that we bring together and we find that it has consequence or usefulness. We'll talk about usefulness and consequence in the future, but for now, let's just kind of talk about the idea that we understand that something is valuable or not. If I draw a map, I go into a neighborhood and I don't know the neighborhood, and I take a piece of paper and I decide to kind of like uh, draw, illustrate somehow like that this street, as I measure it and make this certain distance, try to calculate the angles, and I can kind of start to locate things. This map may not necessarily be the truth about this neighborhood, but it may be a useful guide to allow me to move through this place and gather kind of some of the things that I need in order to kind of like be able to kind of manifest my needs within the neighborhood, to get to work, to get home, to kind of buy groceries and my laundry. So now we have the situation where we kind of like have a value or consequence to something. This map may not be the truth, but it illustrates certain valuable things that allow me to kind of use it in a useful way. So now to an unbreakable bond. In my case, one of I think most fundamental unbreakable bonds is curiosity and imagination. My curiosity is that which kind of constantly kind of is an impulse in me that tells me or asks me, hey, what is that? There's a curiosity, there's a kind of there's an interest of like, hey, do we want to know what that is? Are we interested? Are we curious about that? And my imagination always kind of loves the challenge of kind of like, let's see what indeed this kind of does for us. Let's see what in fact this seems to go if we seem to kind of move in this direction. So in that case, it's like we want to basically have those two things. So that's an unbreakable bond between curiosity and imagination, which allows us to kind of like be able to kind of discern things, or at least have an impulse to discern things, and that's kind of useful. And we also talked about Darwin. We talked about this idea of persistence. Well, later we'll talk about the difference between tradition and culture. That's coming up in a couple of weeks. And one of the things it talks about is the idea of the fact that, like, there are things that we do traditionally, and then there's things we do culturally. And that kind of goes to something I've talked about before between, an unbreakable bond between like what I call technique and reason. So another unbreakable bond is that of between technique and reason. And I gave the example before about the fact that sometimes when we have technique, we've used technique and we've linked it to things in the past that were not reason-based. I was at the Metropolitan Museum today, kind of looking at some pieces of looking at work by Paul Rudolph, but also recently there's a new show in the Chinese wing that looks at the bronzes. And one of the things that we're, see is that like people have had the ability to have fairly advanced techniques. The thing was, what was the bond that technique had that allowed it to kind of and how was that allowed to kind of let it progress? When we have technique and we kind of we embrace the idea of the way in which we kind of like measure that technique or kind of gauge that technique is through superstition or religion or some non-reasoned circumstance, we come to the fact that we have certain advantages that come with technique being related to reason. When technique is related to superstition, what would happen is if we want rain in order to have the crops, in order to have a bountiful harvest to feed everyone, we might do a dance and think that the dance will please the gods because we believe in the gods. And we believe the gods are basically withholding rain for some reason. So we please the gods by kind of doing a dance. Some of the more nefarious things, or some of the more kind of like barbarous or kind of foolish things at the very least, was when we sacrificed animals or we sacrificed humans. And we did these things in order to kind of like feel as if that was more likely to get us what we wanted. We now realize that those things don't work. We also realize that, like, when people say like how many witches were burned, no witches were burned because no witches existed. So these kind of superstitions that motivated us to have these ideas, we now realize because we have reason that these things were foolish. There were even people who believed that eating the bodies, the flesh of your enemies, were things that would bring about powers. There was no way to prove this. It could be maybe something that we could kind of say there was some kind of scientific basis for it, but now we'd have to actually do that. But the reality was we engaged in cannibalism, we engaged in ritualistic suicide, we engaged in slavery. We still do, and in a larger kind of scope of the world. But at the same time, we've come to understand that like doing so is wrong, and it's wrong because certain principles exist that we realize kind of were not in place before. We believe in the idea since Darwin that we're all basically coming from the same circumstance, that we all basically come from prior organisms, and these prior organisms can be kind of looked back. One of the things we realize is, like, I believe that there's a generative operation of the metaphor that kind of ties all these things together, right? This sense of entanglement that allows things to kind of accrete and develop kind of opportunities that they generate their own metaphorical opportunities that create new things, that from basically energy, we came to have motion and energy, and then there was accretion into particles, and then particles basically became elements, and elements became uh, other things, and then eventually we had, you know, carbon, and then eventually we had amino acids, and we had proteins, and then we basically had the ability to kind of have, things start to kind of become life forms, because these things had the ability, because of their configurations, to have operations that were valuable. So anyway, long roundabout way, we come to the fact that there were certain things that we start to establish our Western modern civilization on, based on certain unbreakable bonds that we've come to see have circumstance. However, one of the great indicators of this that gives us the opportunity to see where we are is when we basically kind of like go back or don't recognize or appreciate them enough. One of the things we talked about when we talked about criticism was the way in which criticism is viewed today, given its essential nature in terms of helping us make valuable consequential moves in terms of things, in terms of the objects and the actions of ourselves. We have kind of limited ourselves because of the derogatory and kind of like way in which we view criticism. By putting criticism in a pejorative light, we take away that ability to kind of see the benefit of it. And the reason we do that is, I believe, a certain emotional frailty. I believe that we kind of have a difference in the way we see ourselves as the way we want to see ourselves, and that anyone points that out, that causes us a problem. And rather than deal with that problem, as Carl Sagan said, you know, that people would rather live a lie than admit that they're wrong. And usually, people who are somewhat emotionally frail are more apt to basically say that the issues in their lives are a result of other people rather than themselves. So that ability to kind of have introspection and kind of self-reflection is something that I feel is one of the things that kind of like is a concern. I think in a society that wants to pride itself on progress, and wants to pride itself on benefit and gain, it has to basically allow itself to kind of see those things. We have a situation, I feel, where there's a persecution of genius. There's a persecution of success. There's a persecution of people who strive to achieve based on the principles of our society and what we realize has gotten us this far. But we seem to kind of be somehow questioning those things. So one of the people I found was probably one of the most instrumental people in my life was David Hume. And his treatise on human nature was a book that I found was incredibly complex, intricate. I'm still trying to understand it. I don't say that I'm an expert on this work. I don't believe Hume believes in free will, but I think he believes it's a benefit to believe in free will in terms of the fact that it kind of benefits you in the way in which you act. But I think he feels as if the way in which you act is much more erratic and spontaneous than we may believe it is. I mean, his idea of identity is much more sporadic and kind of unformed than we would take for would take for granted, certainly today. And maybe there's something in that to be looked into, in terms of the fact that one needs to kind of look into why we feel our identity is so clear and so strong, when in fact we seem to kind of just be kind of like at the whim of impulses and desires, what he calls passions. So what happens when we, Hume says quite clearly, and I agree with him, that our passions are what drive us. And that though we have reason and we have math and we have logic and we have these things, these are there to kind of help us appreciate these desires and kind of temper these desires in a way that we can kind of make some kind of an evaluation on them. And if not that, in case of in terms of Hume, certainly in terms of what I say. So the idea is, like I said, the technique could be replaced also with the passion, with the desire, the impulse, an impulse to do something. And like in the second book of the treatise, he talks about the passions. He talks about the nature of the desires, and the one he ends up with, the last, is the nature for truth, which is something that he kind of sees is a pursuit unto itself that has its own value in itself, which I kind of see is kind of basically kind of that similarity with the idea of kind of curiosity and imagination, that it has a benefit for itself. And I think that he kind of says that, a person will desire to understand something and will talk about the fact that it has a great consequence for humanity, but that person may not have a real impulse or concern for humanity. The idea is not so much that the concern is humanity's concern, but he feels that because of the magnitude, that it's a desirable issue. And therefore the individual kind of like can basically have a great desire for it. So these things is comes from a healthy approach to understanding why we want to kind of continue to move forward. So in terms of that idea of kind of societal health, the idea is to kind of like try to find a way to kind of move in a positive direction if such a thing is possible. Now, I believe that when we can establish the fact that when we've made these, we can stack up these unbreakable bonds and kind of graph these in relationship to other times, we realize there are benefits to this, which kind of also kind of alludes to what Whitehead talks about in, in his book about civilization, where he talks about the fact that there's a slow movement towards civilization, and that just like evolution, it's not a given, but there are certain kind of opportunities that you can benefit from by seeing them and kind of taking them in that direction. Now, I mean, again, in Whitehead, there is a God, at least in the sense that there's kind of philosophical placement of a kind of situation that may be an individual with ultimate perspectival magnitude. Now, that basically is something that based on the idea of the nature of becoming metaphysical, ontological reality of Whitehead, that kind of seems like almost an essential thing, almost to say that there is possibility, but one can never attain it. So therefore, but it does exist in terms of a kind of like an application. So now we come to the idea of the emotional attachment. So what happens and what I see is, and this is kind of like one of the things that I think is kind of part of the division that I see among people, is the fact that, like Carl Sagan said, we don't have that ability, but we need to develop that ability to kind of like not get emotionally attached to ideas where when they become no longer useful, right, that we can dispense with them. And I think that's kind of one of the things we see here, is that I think that there are certain people who do not dispense with them, and that may just be because they don't want to look at what drives the desire. And again, there are impulses, there are desires. In the case of Hume, he talks about the fact that these are the things that kind of motivate us. This is what we start from. This is our engine. But, he, of course, writes this in the 18th century, before Darwin kind of like brings up the idea of this kind of accretive, kind of benefit or move towards a kind of like a kind of complication or a sophistication, as it were, from a less from a more primitive state. Even though this is kind of like something that at the same time is much more of a kind of a nervous circumstance for people like Hume in the 18th century, who have seen themselves kind of crawl out of the swamp onto the land and see the fact that there is finery and nicety and sophistication. But in the case of them, they understand, like Voltaire writes, like Diderot writes, that this is not a given. And we can very quickly kind of fall back upon it and kind of like go back to where we were. And I think there's a certain kind of oblivion, or a kind of intentional oblivion, a kind of way of not wanting to see the fact that, no, we've always been like this. It's like, no, we've been like this only for a short time. And we don't really know if there's a guarantee that could stop us from going back. I mean, in my own experience, in my own life, I look at the fact that for the first 30 years of my life, my lifespan at the time, when I was born in 1959, the average lifespan, I think, was like, for a man living in the United States, it was like somewhere in the 70s, like low 70s, maybe 72, 73 years old. But the idea was, with the Cold War, we didn't know what time, if we would live to tomorrow, because the idea of kind of like a nuclear annihilation based on kind of all the potential opportunities for such were very, very real. So as a result, we came to this circumstance that though that existed, it wasn't something that was necessarily a given as fulfillment. After 1990, we came to understand the fact that maybe there was more possibility that we could start to manifest that idea. However, what I've seen is, as I go on in life, I realize that there's a kind of circumstantial reality. What I mean by that, and we'll go into that in tradition and culture, but let me give you a kind of a little bit of an idea what I mean by that. Tradition is that thing that basically says we do these things because there are things that we do. We eat together, we have these rituals, we have these kind of these celebrations, whatever. But they're based on this idea of persistence as what we basically attain as necessary. Now, I think what happens is, when tradition becomes a culture, you create a correspondence with another bond. You bond that with something else. Tradition doesn't have conditions in terms of survival, in terms of agreeing to persist. It's a given. Culture says there are conditions. Now, this may sound strange, but for me, one of the greatest achievements, one of the greatest inventions of the modern world was suicide. And that may sound really bizarre, but let me explain what I mean by that. Suicide is the idea of putting conditions on persistence. Darwin basically says persistence is our given, it's our default, it's what we do. It doesn't guarantee that there'll be persistence, and in fact, in terms of the finality of the kind of the mortality of humans, it's a given. You're not going to persist for all time. But man may persist for all time. But then again, man is going to transform too. Homo sapiens will become something else. But the point is, there are now conditions under which a group or an individual may decide, no, I'm not going to continue. I'm not going to. This intention to persist is not a given. It's a condition. So under certain circumstances, I will not continue to persist, or we as a culture will not continue to basically kind of like allow certain things to happen, or else we will basically kind of fight to protect them. So, there was that idea that an individual, and now we realize that animals do this too, again, like everything else, just like morality. And this is a kind of situation I'll probably talk about in the future, is the idea of morality. I believe in what I call a natural morality, and that natural morality states that the desire to be good or bad or right and wrong basically pertains to that desire to persist. My assertion of myself against my circumstance is my architecture. So architecture basically is that identity of persistence in the face of nature, in the circumstance of nature. So that verb, the architectural circumstance we talked about, the verb of architecture is actually the thing that basically pertains to what we do. But it's now conditional in a culture as opposed to a tradition. The tradition will do whatever it has to do to kind of continue those traditions, because a lot of times, as we said, those traditions are kind of coupled with superstitions. Our culture, right, becomes coupled with conditions, and those conditions basically are the thing that unbreakable bond between culture and condition, right, between persistence and condition, basically defines a culture. Meaning, people may survive, but this culture, right, will disappear if these things disappear. So that is conscious. It can also be unconscious. It can also be taken from you, right? I mean, as we see in wars, where a group of people, a society, a culture, we can have a genocide. We can basically decide that a certain culture will be eradicated. A culture can also eradicate itself. I mean, we've seen certain circumstances, at least in small scales, where individuals or groups decided to basically kind of like take themselves out of the gene pool. Now, these are all kind of fairly bleak things, but I think they're important in terms of understanding the fact that our desire is to persist, but it's also it entails the idea of progress, of moving towards something that is more sophisticated, more complex, more intricate, and less primitive. So there's nothing that says that we can't go in other directions. It just seems as if there's a desire, kind of like, as Whitehead talks about in Adventures of Ideas, like I spoke about before, there is these things that we look at. So rather a kind of, a history of philosophy where he talks about different ideas. He talks about, in terms of particular philosophers, he talks about the specifics of the ideas, the idea of kind of freedom within Western society and things like that. So now what happens is this is where we talk about that idea of societal health, because societal health should be able to make it very clear now that when we have an idea that is not aiming in the right direction, that basically has proven itself to be not useful, we need to dispense with it. And I think I see too many people now who are, for whatever reason, invested in those things where they can't move away from them, and that's troubling. And I remember something that someone told me, which I thought was very, very important. Now, again, I'm on the left of the political spectrum. I'm a liberal, but like I said, I'm an enlightened. I come out of an Enlightenment tradition of Western society. So I also am an American, so I come out of the political idea of revolution. I believe that basically when individuals feel as if they're not being represented, it's their responsibility to basically take matters into their own hands. But I also make the distinction that there's a difference between, to the British, the Americans were not patriots. They were treasonous, barbarian kind of bastards who were basically kind of like, went against the crown. So one of the things I see today is that people kind of want to talk about reform within the system. And I say, that's fine. Reform within the system is great. When you start burning down government buildings, that's not reform within the system. So when you start to take over police stations, city halls, and the Capitol, you're a revolutionary. You're basically trying to topple a government. When you try to topple a government, you're no longer, and like I said, be clear, right? Are you a reformer or you're revolutionary? If you're revolutionary, be my guest. Say it out loud. If you want to topple a nation, if you want to, by all means, say it, but don't say you're peacefully protesting for that, because you don't peacefully protest for the destruction of a nation. What you do is you do it by revolution. When the Americans basically told the British, we are going to decide our own fate without you, they basically drew a line in the sand and say, like, you will have to try to take us back because we are leaving. I'm all for that. I personally don't believe that America is finished. I don't believe that it's time to kind of like storm the Bastille. But make a distinction. I think one of the things I see, which I find is the kind of tremendous cowardice, is people talk like revolutionaries until the boot's about to drop. And then they're suddenly just peaceful protesters in a mostly peaceful protest. It's not a mostly, there's no saying it's a mostly peaceful protest. I've seen incredible things done in America by people who never raised a hand and who never broke a window. Because what happened was when people saw the injustice that they were subjected to by the police or by the authorities, rational people came to see that that was wrong. It was wrong to basically tell people you don't have a right to expect these things that you have every reason to expect. I grew up in the civil rights movement. I was a child. I watched these things on television. I watched people be assassinated. I watched JFK, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. I watched these people die. I watched RFK be killed. And I realized that people fought for what they had every right to believe in, every right to have, and now they have it. But the idea is these people weren't going to destroy the system. There were people who basically said, we believe that based on what you say, you owe us this, right? And people came to understand. It's like, and they voted. And they basically took their opportunity to say, this is what we need to do. And it happened. And as a result, I've seen tremendous progress in my lifetime in terms of rights for gay people, in terms of rights for women, in terms of rights for blacks. I mean, I remember, even though it wasn't happening where I was, hearing about places where people couldn't go to school. I do remember, however, when they started to kind of say that we don't want to segregate people in Queens. We don't want to have just black people here and Hispanic people here and white people here and Greek people there and these people there. And we want to mix them up and get them to understand that they need to live amongst each other. The problem was they already were. If you lived in Queens Village, if you lived in Astoria, and you lived in a lot of places, these places were already incredibly diverse. Because what happened was working class people needed to coexist in order to survive. The greatest reality of success, of diversity, is the ability to kind of work together to make sure that you can feed your families. So when a black and a brown and a yellow and a white and a green and a blue and a purple person have to put in the toilets to get the boss's job done, they can't think about all these things. Hey, man, let's get these toilets in. Let's get this roof on, right? Let's get these doors hung. One of the greatest things is that if you want to talk about diversity, you need go no further than a construction site in New York City. You will see all the diversity you will ever want to see. I've had job sites where I could count probably between 15 to 25 languages spoken at any one day. If I walk down the streets in Astoria, chances are I'm going to hear every language other than English, right? But again, this wasn't because of any political thing that was done. It was because people realized, hey, man, we got to get the laundry done, got to get the grocery shopping done, got to feed the kids, got to get the kids to school. There was no one coming to help us. We did it because we needed to survive. So, a lot of people take credit for these things, but these things already existed. We made them happen. We made them happen because when I was a little boy and we had snow, the men came out and they shoveled the walks, and the mothers would make hot chocolate and the kids would run back out and forth and play in the snow and make snow angels. But then after the streets were clean, everybody would kind of go downtown to get eggs and milk and whatever. And the people who were kind of older, widows, couldn't get it for themselves. It's like you run into Mrs. Schaefer. You kind of say, hey, Mrs. Schaefer, Do you need milk? Do you need eggs? And she's like, give you money. And your mom would say, don't take Mrs. Schaefer's money. But you took the money and you bought candy for yourself. You didn't tell her. You didn't take Mrs. Schaefer's money to buy, the milk and the eggs, right? And but again, Mrs. Schaefer would babysit. So we understood diversity. We basically, I remember that my first thing I remember looking out the window and kind of seeing people burying pots in the backyard behind my house, and then going to my friend and saying like, it's like this, because I only knew, because when you went to funerals and people were cremated, they gave you these urns. So I'm like, said like, hey, what's with all the dead people? It's like, dead people, it's kimchi. It's like, oh, what's kimchi? It's like, oh, it's fermented cabbage. It's like we ferment vegetables and we put them in the ground and we ferment them. I was like, they're not dead people? They're not your relatives? Like, no, God, that's messed up. What the fuck is wrong with you? So anyway, back to the main purpose, which is like this idea, when ideas get to the point where they no longer fulfill the needs, that you need to kind of look and kind of say to yourself, at what point do I kind of, dispense with these things? Right now, there's a tremendous amount of activity in terms of holding on to things that have seen or seem to be no longer compatible with the desires of the people to move forward, or are clearly indicted in an analysis concerning societal health. When we talked about criticism, like I said before, we saw that. And I mean, what happens is we need to get to that circumstance where we start to think to ourselves, what is it that's holding you back from dispensing with this thing that's basically inhibiting you? Because at the end of the day, if you're going to make anything, and I think one of the reasons why a lot of these kind of like ideological things fail is the desire to generate things, art, culture, writing, fail because they lack integrity, because they lack honesty. Like we talked about before, we may sometimes uncover truth because we honestly think that we see what we see. We can also accidentally stumble into truth without knowing it. But I find it's more likely that you're going to stumble into, oh, I know. Why did he start with that? Now it's coming back around. So I've seen people who have desired for truth and basically reached some certain understanding about truth by having a desire to kind of assess honestly what they were doing. And like I said, there's also the possibility that you can accidentally back into truth without really knowing it, and you kind of came at it with a kind of dishonest approach. But I find that rare. And I find it kind of like it's not something that you can kind of chart. You can never say, well, here's how I accidentally backed into truth by basically starting with a dishonest approach. I don't see that. And I mean, sometimes you can walk down the street and you can find a $50 bill and you say like, oh, I didn't intend to look for a $50 bill, but you could make up a story. It's like, if I go out on Wednesdays, but again, now we're back to this idea that if we sacrifice virgins to the gods, it's going to rain. So again, that emotional attachment basically is something that is an indicator of societal unhealth, or a societal kind of like anomaly that needs to be addressed. Because in order to kind of have that ability to discern good judgments and to be able to kind of make kind of a desire to really understand, and this is next week's topic, which is understanding and judgments. And we talked about this is because it's related to criticism and judgment. Is it, the ability to kind of discern the value of the information that's given to you. If you start with an honest position, there's a certain integrity that kind of manifests itself in that case. So this was a good one, because we kind of came through a lot of things, but we came to a kind of circle and we circled up. But again, I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a poet. I'm an architect. I probably spent too much time reading books on philosophy, but I mean, I find it was probably part of my desire to try to understand. And I kind of feel as if like truth, beauty, love, these are the things that drive me. My curiosity, my imagination always kind of have me moving towards these things. One of my favorite books, maybe my favorite book, is Dostoevsky's Idiot. And I believe what's brilliant and what's so beautiful about that book is that Prince Mishkin manages to keep himself innocent in spite of incredibly harsh circumstance, in spite of a circumstance of kind of like, usually when we talk about a person who's had harsh circumstances, we think of somebody who becomes bitter, jaded, and becomes somewhat guarded in their ability to kind of obtain that an innocence towards their curiosity and imagination. Because like a lot of times, like, you'll see children, they simply don't know the dangers. Life teaches the dangers, but those dangers don't have to become obstacles in order to kind of like temper your curiosity and imagination. They can still allow you to kind of have that same curiosity, that same kind of freedom in terms of expressing your curiosity and imagination. But you have to have courage to do so, because you realize like I could get hurt. There's a difference between, and I learned this because I realized I was this way. There's a difference between foolishness and courage. I mean, I was like, was it fearless and courageous? Fearless means you're too stupid to realize what you're doing. That was me. Julie has a term. She calls it pulling Bruce from the wreckage. Yes, I do. Yes. And pulling Bruce from the wreckage was usually, I was too stupid to realize what a ridiculously, stupid thing I was doing. And then like, when I would be laying on my back with kind of like, and pulling pieces of glass out of my face, I would say like, I didn't see any problem at the time. I didn't see how it could have gone wrong. But the reality was that's part of who I am. But then I came to realize my innocence is not maintained by courage. It's maintained by stupidity. So I had to realize that in terms of my harsh circumstances, or my circumstances, whatever they may be, right? I needed to kind of make sure that I kind of didn't simply ignore reality, that I appreciated reality, because it actually added a richness to the experience. So the thing is, when you realize, right, how much more visceral that is, it actually lends a lot more kind of appreciation and a lot more kind of like satisfaction to those things. It's like, oh, look, I did this. It's like, did you realize you could have got killed? No. As opposed to like, did you do that? It's like, I risked it because I felt this was a valuable thing to kind of look for. So based on that, we need to kind of maintain that innocence, and we maintain that innocence through our honesty. And our honesty basically needs to kind of, as Carl Sagan says, tell us when we need to know when we need to kind of like, when we're living a lie, and we need to admit that we're wrong. So we're like, so we don't continue to go down a road where we can maybe accidentally back into truth, but we're never going to honestly kind of like chart a path to truth. So next week, 23rd of March, understanding and judgments, which is kind of like similar to criticism and discernment, but it's actually something that I feel as if is part of this kind of emotional attachment to ideas. I think that a lot of times people feel as if in making judgments, I can assert the idea of my authority. The thing is, the authority and the judgment basically has to come from something of consequence. What is it that gives you the authority? It's usually the ability to discern understanding and to demonstrate understanding. Anyone can say, that's stupid or that's garbage, but it means nothing. You need to be able to say, this is lacking because of this. So that's what the next thing is to be, is that we need to make sure that in order to make judgments, we have the proper understanding in order to bring authority to that judgment. All right, so that's it for now. We did a little bit better today. We didn't kind of speak for an hour. We're just about 50 minutes, and I kind of felt, I felt because, the first time I talked about this, I felt the same things. Like, I'm not gonna be able to talk more than 5 minutes, but before you know it, here we are back in the 50 minutes. So here's our closing, and the realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to the benefit of all for us to maintain this. Thank you.